Hi, and welcome to Philosophy of Psychology Week 6, and this is the key concepts video for this week. And we're starting a new segment this week on self and society, and we're going to be spending the next few weeks really talking about this relationship and trying to see if we can understand the kind of co-influence of the formation of the self through society and how every society depends upon a certain formation of self. And we're going to look at this through an article by Philip Cushman called Healing Through Self-Domination. And it gives us a reading of sort of the modern era, so from the 17th century roughly up to the sort of 21st century. And there's a reading of some of the important kind of context in which we can see the way that sort of social ideas and values, form and sort of create the self that appears in psychological thinking and research. So we're going to have a look at this, look at Cushman's article and see if we can make sense of the story that he tells about the modern age in this article, starting with sort of the contrast with the pre-modern world. Okay, so we see a number of things that characterize the sort of pre-modern world before the kind of transition in the 17th century to modern forms of understanding the self and the world around us. And in the pre-modern context, we see a number of sort of key things. The natural world is not a realm of it's not a realm of scientific research. It's a reflection of God's truth. And there are sort of similarities, comparison symbols all through the natural world that reflect the truth of the Bible and the truth of God. And this is sort of a typical pre-modern view. Madness is seen as a result of satanic possession, so there's a kind of struggle between God and Satan for the soul, and that's how sort of madness is understood in the pre-modern world. And individuals are born into specific roles that determine their fate. Of course, that's the context of feudalism before we get to sort of the modern age, and individualism and capitalism. So individuals are sort of born into specific roles. Your birth determined your economic fate and your social existence, and there was no changing of roles or upward mobility. So in the modern era, the world becomes disenchanted, to use a famous phrase of Max Weber. There are no demons or spirits that possess people, so the idea of satanic possession kind of drops out. There are no kind of spirits that enchant particular places, so the world is disenchanted. It just becomes a sort of framework of inert stuff that humans can use and manipulate. But the sort of interplay of kind of spirits and sort of nature is lost in the modern world in the transition that's made to modern thinking. So let's take a look at some of the central elements of that transition. So we see in the modern era and the rise of the idea of mental life, a new understanding of mental life and illness, and how they're sort of interrelated. So we get a number of sort of transitions here. We get a turn away from the sort of embeddedness in community, the kind of feudal way of thinking of individuals as sort of constrained by their circumstances of birth. And individualism develops as an idea that each individual is sort of charged with sort of making their own way, with becoming their own person. So much more onus on the individual as sort of forming their own life. And that's combined with a new sort of understanding of economic life and capitalism, which, as Cushman sort of emphasizes, brought about a new kind of domination, a domination of capital over labor, And we see that in the history of capitalism and the exploitation of workers in the early sort of stages of capitalism, when workers don't have any power and the sort of the owners of property possess all the power and are able to sort of set the conditions of work. So that's one of the new forms of domination that we see. An empirical science, so a new understanding of the natural world is no longer sort of inhabited by spirits and demons, but now it's simply a world of inert matter controlled by the mind. So the mind sort of, and the sort of calculations of which our minds are capable is what gives sort of order and sort of makes sense of the natural world. By itself, the natural world is just a realm of inert matter, stands ready for sort of use in human calculation. And so there's this kind of inertness of the physical world. It sort of stands opposed to human endeavor and human power, ready to be worked upon. So a new configuration of the self was coming into being, driven by these changes, and at the same time as we saw new forms of domination, capital over labor, male over female is another one we'll talk about shortly, and mind over body, as we'll see. So these new forms of sort of domination, of sort of lack of equality in these areas are sort of coming in and sort of making a new kind of configuration of self. Now, I think this is a key quote that Cushman uses to sort of describe this transition, on page 93 of Healing Through Self-Domination. He says that in the course of less than 2 centuries, the frame of human being underwent a radical shift. So this is describing the transition to the modern age in the 17th century. What was once a spiritual being who contained a soul and was embedded within a community that was in turn held in the hand of God, had become an early modern individual who contained a mind which was dependent upon the domination of reason and will over the wild emotions of the body. So that becomes a new way of sort of thinking of human nature, that we have a mind possessed of reason and will, and the point of those attributes is to sort of control sort of wildness or savageness of the body. So the struggle for the soul between God and the devil that we saw characterizes the pre-modern world gives way to an idea of self-discipline and self-management, right, where we have to use our reason and our will to kind of manage and control and discipline ourselves and the way our sort of the emotions of the body well up and try to sort of throw us off course. So wildness and madness are associated with the body, and it is the instrument of the mind that is called upon to tame the body, to guide it towards the path of civilization. So Cushman talks of a new form of control here that aligned with the new value placed on individuality and personal independence. So it's no longer that individuals are constrained by their birth, they're no longer constrained by sort of living a particular social role. There's a new sort of individuality and sense of personal independence. But that's underpinned by this idea that we each possess a mind that sort of controls, dominates, and disciplines the body. And that's the central sort of element that makes up the modern self. So these new practices of self-discipline were developed in the typical new social institutions that emerge in the modern era. And these institutions saw themselves as working on the rationality and the will of individuals, allowing them to triumph over the uncivilized and animal instincts of the body. So we have the workhouse, people who were sort of indigent or sort of unable to support themselves or for whatever reason, unable to work, were collected together in workhouse and subject to kind of regimented military style discipline. Asylums, again, became another institution where people who sort of didn't fit or needed to be taught how to sort of monitor and surveil themselves and control and discipline themselves. That took place in the asylum. Schools, of course, became, certainly in the 19th century, a sort of an institution, again, that sort of housed large groups of people, children, and sort of taught them these rudiments of sort of discipline and regimentation. And finally, the prison becomes an institution of sort of reform, of sort of self-policing in the modern age, where individuals sort of learn to police and discipline themselves. So in all these institutions, individuals were to be made capable of watching themselves. That's the key thing, that it's like the mind becomes the sort of, takes the place of society as the mechanism that disciplines and keeps individuals sort of focused on the right thing and the right path. The surveillance performed by the institution, the workhouse, the asylum, the school, and the prison, was in fact internalized. So it's individuals tuck into their minds this idea of surveillance, of sort of watching, of observing, of self-disciplining, and through participation in these institutions, they sort of internalize this surveillance disciplining role, and the mind becomes the entity that then practices that self-discipline. So the individual takes on the role of policing their own instincts and reactions. So we go from a sort of social control to a form of self-surveillance. And as we talked about with Foucault earlier in the course, and his central idea of the panopticon here as the sort of the key sort of surveillance mechanism. So everybody is being watched all the time, and you assume that you're being watched even if you don't know for sure whether you are or are not being watched. So according to Foucault, what this system did was bring about the internalization of that coercion over time. So individuals begin to watch themselves because of this experience of constantly being watched. They sort of take on this capacity to monitor themselves. So there's this exercising power over individuals in order to make them productive for social purposes. And of course, in the modern age, what's needed for the new industries are disciplined and docile workers. Workers who sort of do their job, who don't complain, who can discipline their emotions and their feelings so that they can work for long hours at tedious tasks. And all of this work of institutions and training and self-discipline is serving this social imperative. So Cushman points out that in order to develop self-domination, inmates in the prison or wherever had to develop the capacity to spy on, to discipline, and to reward themselves when doctors and orderlies were absent. So that's the kind of internalization of this process where instead of sort of being dominated by a social authority, individuals are taking that scheme into their own minds and effectively dominating, disciplining themselves and controlling their own sort of emotions and reactions. Okay, so once the idea of madness and irrationality were located in the body, as we saw happens in the modern age, we see this idea of a sort of split between the rational mind and the sort of wild, savage body. This had grave consequences for women who were thought by doctors and society to be defined by their reproductive system and hormones. These biologically based theories obviously obscured the social conditions of women's lives, the conditions that were actually responsible for their illness. So we get a number of new illnesses that were thought to apply specifically or largely to women, such as hysteria, neurasthenia, and others that were seen as sort of typical for women and that were sort of treated by doctors. But women's economic dependence on men the socio-political restrictions on their dress, on their speech, on their behavior, what they could say, what they could do, the lack of personal autonomy. All of these things were thought to just be the natural order of things. So doctors were unable to see beyond the cultural horizon of their time. They were unable to see the way that these kind of economic relations and women's sort of social dependence were making them sick. And instead we get these sort of a host of theories about hysteria being sort of biologically based. Hysteria, in fact, derives from the Greek word for uterus. Women were seen as essentially poisoned or sickened by their biology and their organs. And doctors simply could not recognize that the symptoms they suffered were a kind of veiled rebellion against the severely restricted roles reserved for women. So that sort of social horizon, they could never sort of get beyond that sort of limitation. In fact, we can see in the sort of the illnesses that were associated with women, we can see the way that their bodies spoke about what their mouths were unable to articulate. They're suffering at the hands of an oppressive social system that confined them to a domestic role. They just, because they didn't have any sort of public voice, any means of self-expression, they wouldn't, for the most part, have been able to sort of articulate the cause of their suffering. But their suffering certainly sort of embodied that idea and reflected that kind of rebellion against the way they were sort of confined and sort of robbed of their autonomy in the social sort of relations that were pervasive in the 18th and 19th centuries. Okay, so the article finishes with a discussion of Freud and talks about Freud's interesting tripartite theory of the soul here. Similar to Plato's, there's a sort of three-part scheme. But Freud had some sort of interesting insights into some of the sort of ideas of self-domination that we've been talking about, even though he didn't quite make the connection, and even Freud didn't quite manage to sort of grasp the cultural horizon that was kind of limiting their insight into social and economic conditions. So we get with Freud this sort of three-part theory. We've got the id, the ego, and the superego, and this is Freud's account of the mind. So the id is the home of the physiological drives that must be repressed by the internalized norms of society. And this is the basis of Freud's famous theory of the unconscious. Right? Hidden from view in the unconscious were wishes and fantasies, lusts and hatreds, urges and drives, and these psychological processes were what caused people distress. So the norms of society show up in the superego. It's the superego that represents society and its sort of commands. So the characteristics of domination and submission of the modern age, which we've talked about, the domination of capital over labor, of men over women, of soul over body, all of these appear in Freud's theory. The rational ego must control the drives, the id and the superego must submit to the ego. But Freud, and this was really his genius, was also aware of the painful consequences of that domination, the way it created suffering in individuals and, of course, especially women's lives. And that's so he was able to get some of the insight, but without sort of making the connection with social conditions. So we've got, when we think of these three elements of Freud's theory of the mind, the ego, the id, and the superego, we can think of these as representing three different elements. We've got sort of the instincts, our kind of biological, emotional basis. The id, we've got our rationality in the ego, our sort of our sense of reason. As we saw, that's an important thing for Plato as well, although understood in a slightly different sense. and the superego, which represents the imperatives of culture. So we've got biological instincts, the historical inheritance of human reason, and the demands of culture. And all of these three are kind of struggling for kind of dominance, struggling for control. So Freud gives us this idea of the mind as a kind of interior battleground, which nicely reflects the way we've seen and we've talked about the kind of forms of domination in the modern age and how we've got a sort of struggle of the mind against the body, capital against labor, men against women, that sort of battleground and sort of antagonism is very much reflected in Freud's theory of the mind. Okay, so most important thing this week, we've got essay 1 due at the end of the week. And because it's an essay week, I'm giving you a break on the markup assignment and the voice thread assignment for this week. So the only task is for week 6. Again, if you want to talk about the essay this week, I'll be available for office hours if you want to email and set up a time. But that's the main task for this week, is the essay will be due at the end of the week. Reach out if you have any problems or if you want to talk about any aspect of the essay or anything else this week.